This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is sponsored by the Eden Project by Rotem Shani, located on Hasavion Street, right across from the Scheinfeld neighborhood in the heart of Beit Shemesh, quite close to my home in Ramat Beit Shemesh Aleph. This puts you in a convenient and central location that has easy access to religious ganim, schools, shuls, and shopping, but is also surrounded by trees and parks and overlooks the Elah Valley. The development will include 5 beautifully designed and spacious apartment buildings, but this isn't just a typical complex. This is a community that will be nurtured by a shul with a wonderful rabbinic couple. I mentioned last week how excited I was that Rabbi and Rebbetzin Benny and Chani Krohn of the Young Israel of Teaneck will be making Aliyah and leading the spiritual development of this project in order to create a kehillah with an unwavering commitment to Torah values, Ahavat Yisrael, and the core principles of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. The fact that Rabbi and Rebbetzin Krohn will be part of the Eden Project means that everyone who's fortunate enough to join this community will be able to grow together with these wonderful people. For more information, please contact Rena Weinberg by emailing info@edenbeitshemesh.com. That's info@edenbeitshemesh.com. You can find the link in the description of this podcast.
October the 7th was a moment for both diaspora Jews and Israeli Jews in which many of them moved, if we're talking about diaspora Jews, moved beyond apathy, and for Israeli Jews moved beyond just, oh, I'm an Israeli and that's enough. And all of a sudden they recognize once again that they are part of something bigger than themselves. So then the question becomes, how are we now going to kind of leverage this moment as a people, as individuals, and use it to formulate or to think about our future, think about moving from the covenant of fate to the covenant of destiny.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. I recorded this episode hours before the first 3 Israeli hostages were slated to be released, and as a ceasefire was just beginning to be implemented by Israel and Hamas. Many people have noted that while Hamas is parading throughout Gaza and claiming victory, which is an absurd inversion of reality, and while the vast majority of the world is celebrating the end of hostilities, at least for now, the population which is the most muted about it are the residents of Israel, who have extreme mixed emotions, even as the strong majority of the country support the implementation of the ceasefire. All Jews who care about Israel have no choice but to look back at the past 15 months, and what came before it as well, to try to get a sense of perspective and to understand what has happened, what has changed, and what changes we will experience moving forward. And in terms of acquiring that perspective, there are few people whose words are more welcome than those of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks Zatzal, the former Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom. Rabbi Sacks passed away over 4 years ago, and we obviously cannot know what he would say about our world today. However, as my guest, Dr. Tanya White, wrote to me, since October 7th, I've been asked countless times, what would Rabbi Sacks say? My answer is always the same. While I can't answer definitively what he would say, I know what he did say, unless we just need to mine his books to find some answers. For that reason, I'm grateful to speak to Dr. Tanya White in order to learn more about Rabbi Sacks and his thought, as well as her own, in order to better understand how he likely would have addressed the challenges we face today and the best and healthiest ways for us to move forward. We'll get to our conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com, that's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Dr. Tanya White lectures in Jewish philosophy at Bar-Ilan University and serves as a senior lecturer at Matan Women's Institute for Torah Learning. She is the founder and host of Books and Beyond, the Rabbi Sacks podcast. Tanya's written work has been featured in books, scholarly publications, and the Jewish press. Her weekly Torah blog is available on her website, tanyawhite.org. An acclaimed educator, Tanya travels widely, lecturing in Jewish communities and institutions around the world. Dr. Tanya White, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you for having me. Wonderful to be here, Scott.
Today is a very difficult day. As I said in my introduction, we are recording this literally minutes after the ceasefire took hold, at least for now, and we're about to hear about the return of 3 of our precious hostages. This is a very, very difficult time for people emotionally. It's a roller coaster. There's a lot to talk about, and in particular, I'd like to hear about your thoughts and specifically your research into what Rabbi Sacks says about situations like this or said about similar situations in the past. Let's begin talking about challenges facing the Jewish people today. Perhaps we can talk about the change that occurred before October the 7th, 2023, and in the subsequent 15 months.
Sure. So obviously, we all know that October the 7th was shattering on so many different levels, obviously in terms of, the actual events that occurred. But I also think from kind of a paradigmatical perspective of the way in which we tell our story as a people. And perhaps I'll come back to that a bit later. But I think what happens, the way in which we look at the challenges facing Jewry today and what happened pre-7th of October are certainly different. For many different reasons. Let's just think for a second before the 7th of October. And again, there we can divide between, I think, diaspora Jewry to a degree and, what's happening in Israel. Of course, we have similar questions. We have similar things and similar challenges. But I think primarily in the diaspora, Rabbi Sacks in his book, a long time ago, actually in his book, Let in the Scroll, he speaks about the challenges, which was written in 2000, of assimilation and apathy. And I think that the definitive of assimilation and apathy are very good descriptions of generally what we see in the diaspora, what we saw before October the 7th. When you're apathetic to something, it essentially means you're not going to fight for it. You're not passionate. We could even call it like a thin Jewish identity. It's part of my, it's a component part of my identity, but it's nothing that I feel particularly strong about. And therefore, if I kind of let go of it, nothing's going to happen. When there's apathy, there's no need, there's no imperative for me to continue that part of my identity. So that's like one element. The other element, obviously, is apathy the corollary of apathy is obviously assimilation. And I think in the diaspora that was always, there, certainly in a postmodern, certainly when we're talking about America, in a postmodern cultural arena where you have so many choices and so many appealing forms of identity that you can tap into. Why would your Jewish identity be something that you would feel an urgent need? Unless it's really an integral part of your life, why would you feel an urgent need to identify with it? And I think that was like a major challenge with diaspora. In terms of Israel, I think I always have this thing that Israeli Jews their thick Jewish identity is not particularly important because they always identify themselves as Israeli. And Israeli means Jewish for them, for most Jews. But they never really ask that question. Many Israelis, when they leave Israel, many secular Israelis, when they leave Israel, all of a sudden realize that they have to actually make an effort if they want Jewish identity to be a part of their lives. Whereas in Israel, it's kind of part and parcel of living here. You go to the army, if you that's what you do, and you kind of it's just part and parcel of who you are. So really the challenge, I think, in Israel pre-October the 7th, as a people, as a nation, was less to do with assimilation and apathy, much more to do with the way in which the unity, right? Or I would say kind of the polarization that was happening within society.
That was especially manifest with the judicial reform. I don't think that caused it. That simply revealed the fissures 100%. That were always there.
100%. The judicial reform is a classic example. I'm going to come back to it because I actually think the argument about the judicial reform almost is a parallel reflection of the argument we're seeing today about the hostage deal to or against, in the sense that I think actually there's a lot that these two sides of both of these camps, so to speak, have in common. And that is that they both feel passionately and strongly about the future of Israel.
That's the good news.
I always quote Esther Perel. She's a marriage therapist. And she always says that, someone asked her, like, when, she's like a very well-known marriage therapist. She's got many relationships through the hardest of times. And they always say to, if a couple walk into your office and they say to you, she says, and they ask, can you save us? And she'll say to them, if you are angry, if you are shouting, if you are screaming, if all of those things, I can save your marriage. But if you walk in and you're totally apathetic, there isn't a marriage to save. And I think that both sides, like if we're talking about the judicial reform or we're talking about the hostage, whatever we're talking about, if there's passion and both of the sides care about what Israel's going to look like in the future, then for sure there's something to work with. So for me, even though, yes, there's polarization and there were echo chambers, but it doesn't really matter. I think the essence is the method, right? In the same way that for a couple to get through, they're both still passionate maybe about the relationship, but they don't have the means to know how to speak or how to work through their differences or to see outside of themselves and their kind of binary vision. That's where we need to go to a marriage therapist to help us to do that. In the same way, as a nation, we need to go to a national marriage therapist. How do we learn to speak to each other again, right? Because we're both passionate. Both sides are passionate about the future of Israel. So how can we form, and this, I think, is what I want to speak about in the poll, how can we form this new narrative together, this Jewish story that, of course, it's not going to be perfect. We're all going to have to compromise. How can we make that happen?
I'll just say that the story you said about Esther Perel and the marriage therapist reminds me of a story I heard about the Brisker Rav, who was extremely anti-Zionist. He once saw a Neturei Karta, who's also very anti-Zionist, a Neturei Karta member spitting on an Israeli flag. And he said derisively, that man's a Zionist. What did he mean by that? By saying that man's a Zionist, he said, explaining it, would he do the same thing to the Russian flag? No, he wouldn't care. He said, I don't expect anything from them. It's not my problem. The fact that he cares so passionately about how much he hates the state of Israel or the emerging state of Israel demonstrates that he treats it differently from other secular countries. Whereas the Brisker Rav saw himself as a non-Zionist in a very different kind of way. I treat it like any other country. It means nothing to me. It really is sort of a different point, but just reminded me when you described that right there. Let's move on now, though, to what you were talking about before, the differences that happened after the 7th of October, the main challenges facing Israeli and diaspora Jewry afterwards.
So I want to adopt, or I want to borrow, really, the terms Rav Soloveitchik uses in his very well-known essay, 1956, or it was actually a lecture he gave, but it was then turned into an essay that was written, Fate and Destiny, Kol Dodi Dofek, where he really actually it's the only time he really kind of sets out a Zionist agenda and also speaks about the Holocaust. It's kind of his post-Holocaust philosophy and his Zionist, theology. And there he speaks about two covenants of the Jewish people. He calls it the covenant of fate and the covenant of destiny. Now, this essay, by the way, happened to be extremely influential on many people. And one of those people is Rabbi Sacks. And we see that there are many, many times that Rabbi Sacks draws on the motifs and the imagery and the language of Rav Soloveitchik's essay in his writings. He defines it as fate and faith rather than fate and destiny. But many, many times, especially in his book, in a letter in the scroll, and in many other places, he draws on this essay. And I think the essay is so, even today, it's so relevant on so many different levels. Let's just think for a second what Rav Soloveitchik says. Rav Soloveitchik says that after the Holocaust, many Jews kind of tapped into their Jewish identity because of tragedy. And because of that, they understood that they were connected to the Jewish people through chains of, what he calls it, chains of like pain and connection. When a Jew suffers in France, right, a Jew in America feels the pain. That's what he kind of calls a covenant of fate. And he actually uses the Exodus as the biblical paradigm for a covenant of faith, that we had no choice. God took us out and we were connected to our people, and we didn't have agency. It was like kind of forced upon us. It reminds me, by the way, my father always tells the story that in 1967, many Jews felt that way. All of a sudden, in the podcast, Rabbi Sacks podcast, I interviewed Natan Sharansky, and he explains that until 1967, he felt that Judaism was just kind of a disease that you had to a chronic disease that you had to just kind of get through, and despite your chronic disease, succeed. But from 1967, something shifted, something changed, and he recognized that Judaism isn't a chronic disease, but it's actually something to be proud of and something to wear a badge of honor. Rabbi Sacks has exactly the same experience in 1967 in Cambridge University. My father's Zechrono Livracha, he recalls that when he used to work in the East End in London in the textile business, and he recalls he always used to wear flat cap on his head. But just after the 67 war, he was driving, and he was wearing kippah. And he said he had people in the cars literally hooting him, putting their fingers up like, well done, well done. Something shifted both externally and internally for many Jews in 1967. And even though this essay is before that, I think Rabbi Soloveitchik is referring to this idea of fate, both from tragedy and from success, that you feel some connection with your people. But then Rav Soloveitchik says, how do we transform fate into destiny? How do we transform something that's imposed on us, that's almost coerced on us, that we don't really have a choice, that kind of meets us where we are, to something where we become the protagonists of our future? Not just a past-oriented religion, but a future-oriented religion. Not just something that's a thin identity, that's a component part, but not a very significant part of my identity, but something that's really significant, that I formulate, that's part of who I am, and that I write for the future. And this, to me, I think we're in that moment. I think we're in, obviously for Rav Soloveitchik, by the way, a covenant of destiny was halacha, was mitzvot, was Torah. For Rabbi Sacks, it looks slightly different. For Rabbi Sacks, it's a little bit more generic, a little bit wider. He speaks about the idea of Jewish identity as forward-looking, and we'll perhaps talk a bit later about his book Future Tense. But I think it's like more inclusive than just halacha and mitzvot. I think for Rabbi Sacks, it perhaps is slightly wider than for Rav Soloveitchik. They were talking to different audiences as well, obviously. But I think this is the defining moment for us.
Well, as I understand it, I think Rav Soloveitchik, when he described it, he was describing the difference really between religious Jews and not religious Jews, meaning the covenant of fate applies to all Jews. The covenant of destiny, he basically says, applies to Jews who are Torah observant.
Not just applies, but I think I think it's more than just applies. What Rav Soloveitchik was trying to do here was to create some kind of agenda of inclusivist religion. But at the same time, he was saying, the way that I read it at least, is that as Jews, you obviously connected through a covenant of fate. That's the Exodus. But don't forget, there's also the paradigm of Sinai. And without Sinai, the Exodus, to a degree, you'll just be wandering in the wilderness for the rest of your lives. You need a direction, you need a mission, you need a purpose, and that is given to us at Sinai. So for Rav Soloveitchik, Sinai is the defining moment. It's your thick identity. It's something in which it's not just, one small component part of you. It takes over everything. It's who you are in every definitive element of your being. And for Rav Soloveitchik, that's Sinai. That's when we accepted the Torah mitzvot. That's when we became agents of, the contours of our identity was something that we accepted and we formulated and we created together with God. And that's so, yeah, you're right. You can be both. You can be a Jew of fate or a Jew of destiny. For Rav Soloveitchik, of course, he wanted all Jews to be Jews of destiny. So here I think I want to kind of borrow this idea of covenant of fate and destiny, because I think that October the 7th was a moment for both diaspora Jews and Israeli Jews in which many of them moved, if we're talking about diaspora Jews, moved beyond apathy, and for Israeli Jews moved beyond just, I'm an Israeli and that's enough. And all of a sudden they recognize once again that they are part of something bigger than themselves. That's that like 1967 moment, perhaps for Sharansky and Rabbi Sacks, and my father, is the example I used. And the October 7th moment for us, in a way, is the same thing. You have all these soldiers who had gone to find themselves in India and all ran back. You have these diaspora Jews on the campuses in America that all of a sudden, their Jewish identity perhaps wasn't something they particularly thought about. And all of a sudden they've had to think about it. It's suddenly come face to face and they have to think, so then the question becomes, okay, so how are we now going to kind of leverage this moment as a people, as individuals, and use it to formulate or to think about our future, think about moving from the covenant of fate to the covenant of destiny. And I think it's a really important question. And I think it goes back to how is identity formed? Identity is formed very often through storytelling. What story do we tell about ourselves, about our own identity, our story, and our people's story? And this is really a moment where we have to ask ourselves, what is our story? What story are we going to tell? And what elements are going to comprise that story?
So I'd like to ask just a little bit more about that covenant of destiny in Rabbi Sacks' thought, because you said it was slightly larger or broader in its application than Rav Soloveitchik's. It's not speaking simply about halakha, but it applies to more people, even Jews who don't follow halakha per se. So what is the covenant of destiny in Rabbi Sacks' thought?
Okay, so I think for Rabbi Sacks, he uses the word faith rather than destiny, which is interesting. He talks about moving from a covenant of fate or an existence of fate to an existence of faith. One of the things Rabbi Sacks is very central to his thinking is the notion of victimhood and agency. For Rabbi Sacks, to be a victim freezes you. You basically are frozen. You can't do anything. You're immobilized. And that immobilization kind of turns you into a victim of your, like Rav Soloveitchik speaks about an existence of fate, a victim of your circumstances. But rather,
The disease of being Jewish.
The disease of being Jewish, exactly. Okay, you're born into it. You don't have a choice. You're kind of a victim to your conditions, and there's nothing you can do about it. But for Rabbi Sacks, that is simply not enough, and more than not enough. It takes away our agency and therefore our responsibility. And one of the core elements of Rabbi Sacks' thought is the notion of responsibility. The way I see his thinking often, I describe it as a triangle with 3 points. There's the point of individual freedom, right? For Rabbi Sacks, we're all born free. Obviously, he's influenced by Enlightenment philosophy, but more so by the fact that in the Torah, it's a revolutionary idea that human beings are free, which, in the ancient world, that idea didn't exist. So freedom. And then the other point, we have responsibility. Freedom leads us to be responsible beings. We are able to respond. When we're victims of something, when our tragedies are so large that they define who we are, we actually aren't able to respond. And then finally, in the third corner, in the third, point of the triangle, is covenant. And covenant is that relationship between myself and God. And by the way, for Rabbi Sacks, it's not just myself and God, or not just the Jewish people and the divine. It's also about between each other, that we have a covenant of humankind and we have a covenant with God. And that covenant allows us to work together in order to become agents of change. So for Rabbi Sacks, faith comprises all of these elements. And therefore, he really sees faith as the ability, the knowledge, I think. As much as we have faith in God, God has faith in us. God believes that we have, as human beings and as the Jewish people, we have the ability to change reality, to create a different reality on the ground. Now, for the Jewish people, for Rabbi Sacks, that does mean that we have a very particular mission. And our particular mission is particular because God has given us a specific manifesto, and that manifesto is the Torah. But for Rabbi Sacks, it's slightly broader because if you look at his writings, often it's not as halachically defined as Rav Soloveitchik. It's more broad. It's broad in the sense that I'll give you 2 examples he uses in Letter in the Scroll. He uses the example of a letter in the scroll, literally in the name of the book. It's also known as Radical Then, Radical Now. But that each of us are a letter in the scroll. And without each of us as individuals, the scroll is obviously null and void. So, but in order for us to ensure that the scroll continues and is, pure and usable, we have to play our role. We have to understand that there were generations that came before us, and the generations that come in front of us are dependent on us playing a role. And that role is to be a letter in the scroll, but at the same time to have a unique kind of role to play within that. The other example he brings is a library where there's millions of books and you can choose any book off the shelf, like in postmodern times, any kind of identity. I can choose a story and I can put myself in the story, and the next I can put the book back on the shelf and then take another story. But Rabbi Sacks says there's one book with one story that has your name on it. Now that story those are conditions you're born into. That story already exists. It has your name in that book. There's only one book in the millions of books that exist that has your name. And we like to believe in postmodern times that we can choose everything. But Rabbi Sacks says some things we can't choose. You're born into that story, and that exists. However, there is a page that has not, is an unwritten page that you have got to write, that is dependent on you. If you don't pick up that book and you don't recognize that you belong in that story, that page will forever be unwritten. And that's the future. That's where we move from a covenant of fate to destiny, or fate to faith, as Rabbi Sacks says, where we take agency, where we recognize our responsibility for our people and for the role and the mission that we play in the world, which is particular, which is related to Torah and mitzvot and the particular mission God gave us, and can be interpreted in many, many different ways. But if we don't make that first move to recognize that we have to be that letter, or we have to write that story, then we've already remained at the point of kind of passiveness and not taking an active role in the future of our people. So first and foremost, we have to make that choice to say, okay, this is my people's story. It's on my shoulders as a burden or as a crown, however you want to see it. But now I have to transform it into a badge of honor, because I'm going to make it my own.
What you're saying now certainly reminds me the 3 points of the triangle of the parsha we're reading now in Sefer Shemot, where it says, Shalach et ami v'avduni, let my people go so that they can serve me, or then they will serve me. The idea of freedom, the idea of responsibility, and the idea of covenant are all included in that short phrase that Moshe says to Paro.
Scott, can I just say for a second? So it's interesting. I actually literally just gave a share last week on exactly that idea, that the way that I see Moshe's entire story, I frame it as the move from fate to destiny, that Moshe recognizes that he feels the pain of his people, right? The yireh b'sivlotam, he literally feels, and we were talking earlier about this idea of feeling the pain. Today of all days, all of us are on edge here. Everyone's feeling that pain of the hostage families, of our people, of the hostages. Like, we felt it for the last year and a half, but today so much, so viscerally. And that's Moshe. He feels the pain of his people, but he doesn't yet know what it means to write that next chapter, to take that to a different level, to move from kind of, okay, this is what I feel. This is that 1967 moment, or that 710 moment. I'm not, I know I'm part of these people, but what does that mean? And only when he gets to the snare and God turns around to him and he says, you know what, you are part of your people. And he tells them there's a past, right? Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, but there's a future. I've heard your people's call. And now I'm asking you, Moshe, to join me in covenant and take responsibility for your people and act for your people, because I can't do it alone, says God, or I can do it alone, but I'm not willing to do it alone because I want to do it with you. I want you to be part of the process. So for me, that is the moment for Moshe of the kind of, I would say, that liminal space between destiny and, fate and destiny, right? Fate and faith, as Rabbi Sacks sees it. And for us, I think we are literally in that liminal space right now in our history. And we have to decide as a people and as individuals if we're gonna kind of see the burning bush, turn to the side and accept God's call. Are we gonna do that?
Okay, so I think that's really interesting. I like that shot very, very much. I think this idea of accepting the call, if I'm correct in understanding you properly, Tanya, you're saying that Rabbi Sacks understands it, of course, including Torah and Halacha, but there are other ways of manifesting that. For example, rushing back from India to fight in the Israeli army might be, in his mind, a way of manifesting that destiny in a real way. Whereas Rav Soloveitchik may have a slightly narrower understanding of it. I mean, of course, that's a mitzvah too, but purely in terms of Torah and mitzvot. But I'd like to ask about something else you just said when talking about how we're all on edge today, because this is an experience which I talked about last week on my podcast, and I'm wondering about the difference between the experience of people in the diaspora and people in Israel. I know that my wife Eliza was looking at certain people today in the diaspora, and I'm not speaking about anyone in particular, but some people writing how devastated they are that TikTok is being shut down today. And we were talking about over coffee this morning how I can't imagine, at least I can't imagine, anybody in Israel being devastated about something like that on a day like today when there's so much in our minds. Of course, there are many, many people in the diaspora who are thinking exclusively about what's going on, the Matzav in Israel. Nevertheless, I'd like to understand this dichotomy of fate and destiny, how we see it in Israel and how you experience it both as a former diaspora Jew and now an Israeli Jew. Maybe you can give some ideas of how you understand that dichotomy.
Okay, so I'm actually going to start with a story I tell in one of the podcast episodes, but I'll share it here with your listeners. I think it's really emblematic of kind of the difference between the kind of diaspora narrative and the Israeli narrative. So I took my daughters. I didn't. My mother treated us to see Fiddler on the Roof in Tel Aviv in the theater. It was an amazing production. As we're driving there, I have four daughters. At the time when we went to go and see it, they were between the ages of 18 well, the youngest didn't come, but say 18 and 13 or whatever it was. And we were driving there and I was explaining to them the story and everything else. And then I said to them, you've seen the film, right? And they were like, no. And I'm like, oh my goodness, such bad parenting. I could not believe that they had never seen the film. I was like, what are you talking about? Anyway, we watched it. They loved it clearly because we're a family of girls and they're a family of girls and the thing. And they loved like the whole, even though it was like obviously totally different times, they loved the whole dynamic. Anyway, at the end, obviously, I'm not going to give a spoiler here. Most people know Fiddler on the Roof, right? They are exiled from Anatevka, and the curtains close. And the last scene is them all kind of walking off, trying to find a new home. Anyway, my oldest daughter, who at the time, by the way, was just about to go into the army, and she turned around to me. She said, "Well, that's not the end. That can't be that." Like everyone's clapping, like it's the end of the show. She's like, "That's not the end." I'm like, "What are you talking about? That's the end." She goes, "But it can't be the end." She's like, it's not a happy ending." And I literally looked at my husband. The two of us were cracking up, and we were like, "Yes, welcome to exile jewelry." Like, as in, do you not know that most of the stories from our history don't end happily? And it was like I had an epiphany moment, a crazy epiphany that I suddenly realized my daughter, I came pregnant with her. I was 5 months pregnant when we made Aliyah. She was born here. And I suddenly realized that her narrative was totally different to my husband's and mine. My husband and I grew up in London. Both of us came from Holocaust surviving grandparents. We, for us, that we knew there was this kind of at the back, like, even though we had, thank God, a very stable, happy, life in London. We didn't necessarily, I mean, obviously we always had, moments of anti-Semitism. But Gadol, we didn't really think our lives were at risk, but there was always at the back of your heads. You knew the fragility of your existence in the diaspora. Like, you knew that things could change from one day. It was kind of your parents kind of and grandparents, they kind of embedded it in your mind that like tomorrow something can happen, right? But my daughter had grown up. Every Yom Ha'atzmaut, we sat and watched the planes. We knew we had an army. Yes, of course, there were instances of terrorism. We knew we had enemies. But in her mind, we live in a state where we have an army. We are protected. We are strong. And we have a happy ending. She was living the happy ending of Jewish history. And all of a sudden, I realized that we had two different narratives. And then it happened again. 2 days before October the 7th, we climbed Masada. At the time, 13-year-old, we were telling them the story. I mean, she kind of knew the story, telling it, but she always had this sudden realization. She said, 1 minute, I know it's been disregarded by some historians today that they encamped for years at the bottom of Masada, but let's say that was the story at the time. I told her that story. And she said, but I understand, like a whole platoon of soldiers from the strongest army in the world just encamped at the bottom of the mountain because they wanted to kill a few Jews. She just couldn't get her head around it. She couldn't understand it. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what they did. But you know what? When October the 7th happened and she literally turned to me and with like tears in her eyes, she goes, I don't understand why they hate us so much. And she had that summarization. Micha Goodman, who's a well-known philosopher here, thinker here in Israel, he called it the moment for Israeli Jews of regards from history, right? The moment where suddenly Israeli Jews remember or recognize what the Jews in the pre-Zionist kind of state, when there was the Kishinev pogroms or this pogrom, that they had, this is what they lived with. The fragility of Jewish existence in the diaspora was something that maybe Israeli Jews, and I realized it when I spoke to my kids, they just didn't necessarily get. They might have known it, but they didn't really feel it. And October the 7th brought that alive. So for me, in a way, that covenant of fate, that feeling of like, I relate to my people through this thin identity of, oh, we've got an external threat. People are trying to kill us and we come together. For Jews, that wasn't necessarily, I don't think in the last 2 or 3 decades in Israel, that was something that we viscerally felt until October the 7th. So that I would, speaking from someone in Israel, for me, Zionism, the whole project of Zionism, we can protect ourselves. We have a state, but on October the 7th, the entire apparatus of Zionism failed. There was no state, there was no army, there were soldiers and there were citizens, and they came to the rescue of the people. But there wasn't the apparatus of the state, and there wasn't the apparatus of the army. And therefore, that whole narrative, that my daughter said, at Fiddler on the Roof, the narrative that my daughter said at the foot of Masada, that whole narrative came crashing down. And all of a sudden, we're standing there and we're like, oh, 1 minute. And it's like, it's not just a crisis in terms of the literal, I'm sure you as well, Scott, all of us, for months afterwards, terrible anxiety. You thought people were literally going to come to your door. We live kind of in a moshav, not in the shtachim, but we live between a few Israeli Arab towns. And we quickly had to set up a kitat konanot task force. And you had this anxiety, but from a identity perspective, I think there was a huge rupture for Israelis on October the 7th.
It's interesting because the description of your upbringing in London, where there wasn't real anti-Semitism, there was some, you always knew about it. At the same time, in the back of your mind, you always knew that there's always a chance we're going to have to run away at some point because that's how you were brought up. I've also heard that for people in the United States, but not for me personally. It usually, I think, is the difference, at least in my experience, for people who grew up with Holocaust surviving grandparents versus for me, my grandparents were all born in the United States. My great-grandparents came over from Europe, and therefore there was no one in our family that we actually knew who was a Holocaust survivor. We have learned about cousins, but many generations earlier, and we didn't have a connection with them, who were killed in the Shoah. But for us, it wasn't like that. And therefore, for me, growing up in the United States, in the Boston area, I never had that deep awareness that maybe one day we'll have to run away. I would have laughed at that. I would say it's ridiculous. Of course not. America is different. And by the way, I'm still not sure that I would think or my family would think that that's really a possibility. I think, though, a lot of people have been awakened in the United States who may have before had my kind of attitude, saying we're safe here, everything's fine, and said, well, we're still safe. Things aren't as bad as maybe they're portrayed at times. But on the other hand, maybe it's not quite as safe as we assumed. Things have changed even for people in the United States who have my kind of upbringing.
It's interesting. I think there's this kind of, it's interesting. There's an organization, grassroots organization here in Israel called Harivon Haravi'i, the fourth quarter, led by Yoav Hela. I actually have him speaking on one of the podcasts because he's very influenced by Rabbi Sacks' thought, a secular Israeli Jew. And he created this organization that basically said in every new state, the fourth quarter is the most dangerous, meaning years 75 to 100, because you've already like 4 generations, 5 generations on, and people take things for granted. It's like you accept we're sovereign. We have a sovereign state. We don't need to worry anymore about, the fact that this isn't going to exist. And that's when things start to unravel. And he already started the organization, by the way, before October the 7th, but October the 7th even more so. And I think that muvan me'elav, we take for granted that in America, Jews are always going to be safe. In Israel, we're always going to be able to protect ourselves. And I think on October the 7th, that narrative came crashing down wherever you were. And the question is how we move forward. And for me, this has really been the big question that I've been grappling with Rabbi Sacks, because when I've been doing the podcast, especially in the 2 episodes that are literally dropping this week, episodes 3 and 4 on his book, Future Tense, the challenge today with his book, and I'll in a minute explain what it says, is what Rabbi Sacks say, which I'm going to talk about in a second, is it really Pollyannish? Is he really right in what he says? He basically says that our narrative should not be formulated out of looking backwards, out of, again, a covenant of destiny, right? That anti-Semitism, people defining you as Jews because of the external glance, gaze, whatever it is that defines who you are. And he speaks about the fact that when we buy into fear, which is like what anti-Semitism does, we close ranks. By the way, we do that as human beings. When we're fearful, we literally close up. We become dull, we become narrow. And he says that we'll never be able to fulfill our mission as the Jewish people in the world, because our mission is outward looking. And therefore, we have to engage with the world, both on the cognitive level, meaning we can't just close ourselves off and say we only have the Torah. There's also chokhmah, there's also outside wisdom, outside of the Torah, that we have to engage with because it enhances and enriches the Torah. But also on a very practical, pragmatic level, as Jews, we need to be engaging in dialogue with the outside world, in relationships with the outside world, because that's where we shine our light. And actually, one of the covers of the book is a lighthouse where the light shines out, because that's our role. The thing is that, and I asked this question as part of the dialogue, is it a little bit, in light of 710, is it a bit optimistic? And it was funny because I read a book by Dara Horn called People Love Dead Jews. I'm sure many of the American listeners will know the book. Interesting, fascinating book. And I was determined to interview her about it in regards to Rabbi Sacks' future tense. Oh, there you go. Yeah, exactly.
On the bookshelf behind me.
On the bookshelf, featuring. She's an amazing individual. I absolutely loved interviewing her. She is so dynamic and passionate and amazing. But I really kind of drilled her, because I said to her, in her book, she essentially goes through, it's the most incredibly written book, but she goes through a whole plethora of stories about anti-Semitism, random anti-Semitism and stories here and there. She never mentions Israel. And I said to her, why didn't you? I'm not going to, I'll leave it for the listeners to hear in the book. She explains why she doesn't mention Israel and it's actually in the end something very kind of mundane, not particularly, wow. But the point is that Rabbi Sacks says, no, our religion has to be a forward-looking, forward-oriented religion. Of course, we take the past with us, but we have to write that next chapter. We have to be looking forward. And she says, but you cannot go forward unless you've grappled with the past, unless you understand the importance of anti-Semitism, because it comes back on it repeats itself again and again. And I just wonder whether today, in light of 710, whether how we can define our story. Now, it was fascinating. I just want to tell you, Scott, I don't know, on the anniversary of 710 in Israel, they had a whole load of things on the television my husband and I were watching. Obviously, like stories about what happens on the day and various things. And we watched a whole load of them. And afterwards, I said to my husband, you know what is so fascinating? Of course, they spoke about the atrocities and the terrible things that happened. But every single documentary was framed through the prism of heroism. It was always, this is what happened, and these were the atrocities, and this is what our enemies did to us. But these were the heroes that did X, Y, Z on the same day. And I think so much about the Zionist narrative, how for decades, by the way, after the Holocaust, the people living in Israel just repressed the stories of the Holocaust survivors. They called them, like they said to them, you went like sheep to the slaughter, because Zionism is built on the idea of Jewish strength, of Jewish heroism. So all the time I'm oscillating between, on the one hand, we need to make space for being victims. We need to make space for the atrocities, because without that, we can't heal. And on the other hand, if we only focus on the past and we only focus on the tragedy and the atrocities, we're not going to be able to take agency to kind of move forward to the future.
One of the things that bothers me about Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel, which is Kaf Zayin Nisan, the 27th of Nisan, is that it is not actually, but around the time of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And that was done on purpose. In fact, the official name is Yom HaShoah VeGvura, I believe, the day of remembering the Shoah, the Holocaust, and those who fought back. And I actually always thought that was a mistake, and it bothers me. Leave aside the fact that it's in Nisan. That's a halachic issue, which we can talk about a different time. To me, the problem is it's reframing the story in a certain sense. I'm not sure that disenfranchising is the right word here, but essentially saying the real heroes of the Holocaust were those who fought back, because that fits the Zionist narrative. Now, I say this as a Zionist. I'm not saying it to criticize inherently, but by saying the real heroes are those who fought back, they were the proto-Zionists, in a certain sense, discounts the experience of those who did not have the opportunity or who chose not to fight back, and essentially is implicitly criticizing them as not quite as heroic or not quite as much victims, or maybe too much victims. That always bothered me. I know we have to make a story and we need to create a narrative that will help us. But we have to make sure in that narrative, we don't turn it into a narrative where certain people are considered the bigger heroes or the bigger victims or the people we should admire more than the other ones. I think that sometimes is a danger of making a story. You take certain people and you rise them to the top, and take other people and push them down to the bottom.
So one of my favorite musicals, happens to be Rabbi Sacks' favorite musical as well, is Hamilton. Okay. And in Hamilton, it's what Rabbi Sacks, and I talk about this in the second episode of this series. I bring in his brother, Alan, who told us that one of his heroes was Lin-Manuel Miranda. He's the producer, and the writer, the script writer of the musical theater series production Hamilton. And Hamilton is essentially a story about a periphery character that really, until it came out, was forgotten. You remember all the founding fathers, but Hamilton, till that musical came out, wasn't really one of them. And in one of the very last songs, the wife of Hamilton, the song's called Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story. It's such a powerful song. And she essentially says that I've told your story now. I'm going to make sure that your story lives on after your death. And I think the reason why Rabbi Sacks loved the producer, Lin-Manuel Miranda, was because he took a periphery story about a group of kind of old white men and he made it relevant. He uses Black characters in the musical to be the founding father. He kind of made it very, very relevant. And I think that that's what Rabbi Sacks wanted to do with Judaism. He kind of said, if Judaism is an archaic periphery story and not relevant to my time, my life, who I am, my identity in this moment, it is going to remain a periphery story. If, however, I'm able to make it relevant and bring it to the fore, it's going to be something that's going to speak to me in this moment. I think all the time about this idea of who lives, who dies, who tells your story. I want to tell you, Scott, I actually came back one evening just last week. My daughter had a gymnastics competition, and everywhere you go, by the way, in Israel, for those outside of Israel, you see there's reminders of the hundreds and thousands of people that have died since October the 7th. And every soldier who dies, they create stickers. It's become like a sticker culture. I don't know if you've spoken about it on your podcast. I'm sure you have. That there's lots of stickers that every soldier has like their favorite saying and the picture of them with a sticker.
On a bumper sticker or put up in other places.
Put up in all public places. You see hundreds and hundreds of these stickers. And we went after her gymnastics. She had a gymnastics show. And during the show, there was one performance where two girlfriends of soldiers were part of the performance and they were holding pictures of their boyfriends. And then afterwards you came out and there were 3 or 4 different kind of tables. Each of them was kind of selling something. One was selling beers with the soldier's picture and name on him. One was selling a book that she'd written. And you saw people just kind of walking past and reading a bit about the soldiers, and some people were buying. And I said to my husband, it broke my heart because I thought to myself, it's literally a shook. It's like a marketplace of whose legacy is going to live on the most. Like, how can I get my loved one's legacy? There are so many people that have died, that have fallen, that there's just not enough mind space and ability for us to comprehend and to know about each and every soldier. And it's almost become like this marketplace of whose story do you know? Now, when I go, for example, on the train, I always make sure to sit and look at every single sticker and look at each soldier. But there's hundreds and hundreds of them. How can you do it? And I think that this is really, really the question is like, how do we take all of this insane and immeasurable amount of pain and suffering and the stories of all of these people and not let it draw us down, not let it pull us down? How are we able to, again, not just focus on the heroism, because that's not just the story. The story is tragic. It's a tragic story and we're still living it. And I believe until we get all our hostages back, we're frozen on October the 7th. But how are we going to move on? And that to me is like the question of the moment. Can we move on whilst at the same time, holding on to Dara's kind of people love their Jews? Yes, let's not put blinkers on. There is much anti-Semitism and hatred in the world, and there is much tragedy in our history. But are we able to move forward?
Then let's talk a little bit, Tanya, about healing. I know that one of the ways you've described that we can heal is by using the narratives in the Bible. And I assume, though you can tell me if I'm incorrect, based on what you just said, that largely means taking the narratives in the Torah, taking the narratives in Tanakh, and I'm not going to say reappropriating, but using them for our purposes, being able to understand the narratives in light, much like Hamilton, in light of what we know now and how we understand our lives now. Is that correct?
Yes. So one of my favorite, I should say my pet topics, and I hope eventually to write a book on, is the idea of adversity and resilience in biblical narratives, really in biblical narratives. I really believe that the Torah is the life force of our people. It's where we find every kind of basic principle, both human and Jewish. And that, to me, there's so many lessons that we can learn about the way that our ancestors grappled with real life problems. And one of them is this idea of healing, of facing tragedy, facing adversity, and how we build resilience, how we move forward. And I'll just give you like a couple of examples of things that I've recently just been teaching. Like, I'll give you an example of Adam. Adam is told basically that his whole reality has been fractured and ruptured. He's taken out of this ideal existence and he's put into this non-ideal reality. And it's kind of a verse that gets lost very often in the narrative, but all of a sudden, after God's basically said to him, you've got to work the land and you're from dust, and to dust you'll return. And it's this depressing kind of really kind of first existentialist text of like, you really are Kohelet, like the vanity of, there's nothing in the world. Everything is nothingness. And then Adam turns around and he turns around to his wife and he calls her Chava, Ki hi hayta em kol chai, because she's the mother of all living beings. And the way that I see it is that Adam basically reframes his narrative. Instead of the narrative that God gave him, which is the narrative of, there's fracture and there's rupture and there's alienation, and you're going to have to work the land, and from dust you are and dust you'll return. Adam totally shifts the narrative and he says, actually, you've just given us an incredible gift, and that is the gift of chavaya, of chava, of living, of experiencing, of bringing life into the world, and knowing that actually, even when we die, because we are now mortal beings, there is a legacy that continues after us, and that's the legacy of our children. That's what we bring into the world. So that's like a reframing of the narrative. Another place, by the way, where we see a reframing.
Can I just say one thing about that, which I find interesting,
sure.
before you go on to the others? What's interesting is that God told one story, then Adam HaRishon told a different story, and God records Adam's story in the Torah as well.
Exactly. And I also think, by the way, this is another thing that we've kind of bought into recently as human beings, not just Jews, is this sense of kind of, because of the echo chambers and polarization, this sense of binary thinking, right? That we have to have one or the other. Either my version is true or your version is true, but we can't have both. And the truth is that the Jewish story is both. It's a story of tragedy and suffering and destruction and rupture, but it's also an unbelievable story of strength, of resilience, of heroism, of courage, of future, of all the things that we know we've seen in the last 80 years. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. Like you said, does it have to be just the story of heroism in the Shoah? Can it not also be those people that went quietly to their death, right? And they were also heroes. Like, can we hold both things in our hands? And I think that's what the Torah does. It says to us, it doesn't have to be that story or that story. In some ways, it's both. And by the way, we've seen that in Israel, like how unbelievable these unbelievable people who have suffered the most unimaginable loss that you could ever have imagined, how they've also celebrated and found joy in new ways that they never imagined they would before. And to be able to hold in our hands joy and tragedy at the same time, one would think is unimaginable, one would think is impossible, but we've seen people do it. And it's unbelievable. I'll just give you another story, which I think is there's many stories I could go on and on, but I know our time is very limited. But another story that I particularly love is the story of Rachel. And by the way, Rachel has been such Rachel Mevakar Beneh has been such an imagery that's, it's such a kind of dmut, such a character for our people. We've had so many Rachels who have been such inspirational people. Rachel Goldberg Palin, Rachel Goldberg. There's been many Rachels, and just people who are like Rachel. But Rachel, to me, holds many things together at the same time. I'll give you an example. Like, she has to reframe the way she looks at God. So she wants children. The way that she sees it, her story is a story about bringing children into the world, about being a mother. And she says to her husband, give me children. Go and speak to your God and tell him, persuade him, because you're closer to him than I am, to give me children. And Yaakov turns around and says, am I in the place of God? Basically saying to Rachel, your perception of God as someone that, quid pro quo, you put something in, you get something out. That's not how my God works. That might be the God of your father, right? That might be idol worship God. That's not the God of the Hebrews. That's not the way my God works. My God works through covenantal relationship. And that sometimes means we don't always understand the way in which someone responds or acts but it's about creating a relationship, a proper, true I-thou relationship, in the words of Martin Buber. And immediately afterwards, we don't hear about Rachel praying, but the next thing we know is she gives Bilhah to Yaakov, and she says, I will have children through Bilhah. What has she done? And by the way, when the child is born, she says, Dan is born, and she says, Ki shama b'koli, God heard my voice. Danani Elokim v'shama b'koli, God judged me and heard my voice. She holds two things at once. My fate, my judgment by God is that I'm not going to have children. But God heard my voice and allowed me, through this covenantal relationship that I created with God, allow me to reframe my reality. And she reframes it and she says, okay, I may not be a biological mother, but I am going to think of a new way, a new story that's going to be born through giving Bilhah as the surrogate mother and having a child through her. Now, again, this continues throughout her life. And she never lets go, by the way, of her dream to be a mother. She never lets go of that. But at the same time, she knows that she has to reframe her story. And she does it again and again. And I mean, there's so much to say here, Scott, but I want to just tell you a personal story that unfortunately, my daughter, who lost her best friend since they were 3 years old. We live in a very tiny moshav. There's only 35 families in our kehillah. So literally the kids are like siblings. They grow up together and he was really like her brother. Like she has no brothers. He was always her older brother. And unfortunately, he was killed in Gaza just before Pesach. And the night that he was killed, there was a group of 8 of them and they literally grew up like siblings, like in a way I can't explain because it's such a tiny place. And they were sitting in our house and she said to me, Emma, nothing is ever going to be the same. Like, we cannot go on from this. We are totally fractured. Like, there's no way we're going to be able to move forward. And I turned around to her and I said to her, you will create a new story without Amitai. Like, your story will continue and it will be different. It will never be the same. Something will always be missing, but you will still have a story and you will still continue that story, and it just will be integrated within that story will be the loss. And to me, that's what there's so many narratives, by the way, in the Torah that do this, that whole different stories. Another example, by the way, is Terach. Terach loses his son. It's most you have these, all the lineage, the list.
You're speaking of his son Haran.
Yeah, and he what happens? He loses Haran. It's the first time we hear, except for Cain and Hevel, it's the first time we hear of a parent losing, and we know it's tragic because it says in the face, his son died in front of him. There's obviously some crazy tragedy that happens, and he creates a new story. But what happens? He gets stuck in Haran. Haran and Hey and Chet are very much interchangeable. Really, Terach gets stuck in the place of his son. He tries to create the new story. He tries to go on a new journey, but he can't move on from there. And we know that, by the way, that many Holocaust survivors, they move forward. And then when it came to a certain point in their lives and they suddenly went back to all the things they repressed, they got stuck. This is what happens to Terach, and Avraham continues that story. And I think, there's so many other examples we can use, but to me, this is what we need to do. And this is what the Jewish people have done. We've taken the past with us. It's not that we've let go of it, but we've allowed the space for us to create a new story post 710. What is that going to look like? Now, I don't know if we can do that, by the way, until our hostages are home. I don't know. I don't know if healing can happen. But what I do know is that there are people already writing that story. And you know who they are, Scott? They're the artists here in Israel. I'll give you an example. Idan Amedi, for those of you that don't know him, I really highly recommend looking him up and looking up his songs. He was for those in America, you might know him through Fauda. He's an actor in Fauda, but he's also a songwriter, an amazing artist here in Israel. He was fighting in Gaza, got terribly injured, and he just now released his new album, and it's called, one of the songs, the leading song on the album is called Superman. And he essentially speaks about his own journey, his own personal journey. And essentially, it's a story of adversity and resilience. Another example is, for example, at Tikva Shesh, they have a song called Giborei Al, Superheroes, where they talk about the ordinary people. There's many people here writing the story through song of this moment. And I think that's the cathartic way to do it. And these artists, by the way, some secular, some religious, some non-definitive, they touch so many sectors in Israel. You go to a concert of Hanan Ben Ari, you go to a concert of Yishai Ribo, Idan Amedi, Idan Reichel, all of these singers, and you will find in that concert every type of Jew, every type of Israeli. And they all come together and they're singing these songs, many of them, by the way, from Jewish liturgy or biblical verses, and they're all singing it together. So I think that there is a way we can tell our story, but I think we have to tap into the right means and methods of doing it.
I have 2 comments just on that. The first one is a very specific one, that Idan Amedi was actually in the same unit and injured in the same accident as the accident that killed Gabriel Blum, Zichrono Livracha, whose father sits behind me in Shul, David Blum, and who spoke on my podcast a few months ago about his son, and whose son's first yahrzeit was just now. The second point, though, I'm very touched by what you said about Rachel reframing her story. There's another aspect I'd like to add, if it's okay, because not only does she reframe her story and say, I will have children through Bilhah, but even when she has a child, she's the only one of the imahot who davens on the spot for another child, meaning even when her story seems to have reached its culmination, she finally got the thing she'd been waiting her entire life to have. She doesn't say, now my story is over, now it's over, with a happy ending. She says, no, Hashem, I want another child. Yosef is named after, give me another child. So even when the story has come to its climax, we still don't end the narrative. We say, no, my narrative will continue in a different direction now as well.
I'll take it full circle back to what Rabbi Sacks calls his book about the Jewish narrative, future tense, that we're always looking to the future. That's part. If we only look to the past, we turn into Lot's wife, salt, bitter. But if we're able to hold the past, hold the pain, hold the tragedy, but at the same time, pivot our, oh, by the way, one of the most important narratives is Yaakov, obviously. Yaakov, Ekev, Yaakov always looks to the past. The moment of rupture for Yaakov is when he basically betrays not just his father and his brother, but he betrays his own perception of self, right? And for years and years, he's running after his own tail, after his own shadow. He's all running away from his own shadow, the shadow of betrayal, until he gets to the moment where he's about to meet his nemesis, and he meets the Ish, and the Ish gives him a new name, and he calls him Yisrael. What is Yisrael? Yashal. And Yaakov is the only one whose name oscillates, even after he's given his new name, between Ekev and Yashal, backwards and forwards. And that is the story of the people. Because you struggle with man and God, but you will prevail. That's our story. To prevail necessitates also looking backwards and also looking forwards. And that's the story of Yisrael. That's the story of Yaakov. And that's in some ways our story. I wanted to just add one thing, Scott. And can we go back for a minute to the hostage deal today? Because I think
yes, in fact, that's the thing I wanted to ask you. And before you even say anything, Tanya, I want to make sure we get back to what you said at the very beginning about the commonality between the divisions in judicial reform and the big divide that's taking place right now between people who support the hostage deal and those who think that it's a terrible, terrible thing. I'll point out that even those who support it are still feeling very bitter about it because it's not simple. But there is a divide between those who, the majority of Israelis, who support it and a significant minority who think it's really awful. So I want to make sure we get to that as well.
100%. I think even those who support it know that we're doing a deal with the devil. I mean, everyone agrees on that. But I think I saw, who was it? Someone posted, but when the devil has your children, you have no choice but to do a deal. I do want to say that I think that these dilemmas are not new, meaning if we look back at the stories of Abraham, our forefather, the founder of the nation, he also struggled with these dilemmas, the dilemma of survival, which is essentially this idea that we have to do anything in order to make sure that we survive and don't lose people. And retain the covenantal pact with God, and the dilemma of protecting your family, of protecting those that you love. I'll give you an example. He goes to save his nephew Lot, but he puts his life and the covenantal pact at risk when he does that. But he chooses to. In another instant, he decides that he's going to put Sarah's life at risk in order to save himself and therefore the covenantal promise. And all the time, Abraham oscillates between them. And by the way, I think the text is very ambiguous. I do not think that the Torah gives us a black and white formula about what to do in these situations. I don't think it does. And I think that's what Abraham is learning all the time about the consequences of when survival or the covenantal promise trumps or champions, my relationship with my family. Another example is obviously Gerush Yishmael, when he sends Yishmael away, which he doesn't want to do. And Sarah says, no, you're doing it. And Yitzchak, Akedat Yitzchak, there's many, many different examples. So I think it's always there. I also think Abraham really represents this example of, kind of maybe the Rabbi Sacks example of engagement with the world. His tent is open on all sides. Everyone come in. I'm the father of all nations. And Sarah, to me, represents, when you're closing ranks. She stands at the tent. You're not coming in. You're not coming in. You to only take a wife for Yitzchak from far away, so he doesn't not influence. Yishmael needs to be sent away because he's influencing the future of the people of Israel. She's the pragmatist. He's the idealist. And the truth is, honestly, there are moments in history for Abraham and there are moments in history for Sarah. And we need both. We need both. Neither one is right or wrong. Now, if we go back for a second to the deal, those that are against the deal are not against bringing our hostages home. They want the hostages home. What they're against is giving back 1,900 terrorists because they say their argument is that we're going to lose more in the long run. This is the existential threat to the people of Israel. Those that want the hostages home say, these are our values. These are what have sustained us over the thousands and thousands of years in the nation. We do not leave someone behind. We believe in the sanctity of life. This is the most basic grounding principle that we were brought into the world to shine out to the world, the idea of the principle of the sanctity of life. It's what we've taught the world. It's what monotheism brought into the world, that we're created in the image of God. And if we don't protect those people, what are we doing? What kind of state are we? And I think to a degree, what's amazing is that they're both coming from the same point. They both originate at the same point. And that is the point of the sanctity of life. Those against the deal are saying, you're not protecting life, because when you release these terrorists, there's going to be more lives lost. Those that want the deal are saying, we have to bring these hostages home because this is the most basic value of the state of Israel, the protection of the sanctity of life. They're both coming from the same point. They're just manifesting itself in different ways. And I go back to what I said at the beginning, the same with the idea of the judicial reform or the not judicial reform. One of them is about the survival of the people. One of them is about democracy, but they're both going back to the same idea of the love and the belief in the Jewish state and the Jewish people. And I think that if we are able to take off those kind of blinkers that we've been wearing pre-710, that we only see our view, that we're only looking through the narrow kind of parochial vision of our echo chambers, then we will be able to understand that actually we have perhaps more in common than we think we did. And maybe that will be the beginning of being able to, again, write this new chapter in the history of people where we're able to formulate a story. Of course, formulating that story is going to have some compromise on both sides. But I do believe, I really do, and maybe I'll leave on a positive note, I do believe that there are signs that we can do it and that we have many things in common and that we're able to maybe write this new chapter in our history from the commonalities rather than the things that divide us.
Okay, on that hopeful note, I certainly hope you're right. I'm sure we all hope you're right. And I think there's strong reason to believe that you are. It does require getting past looking at the end of our own nose, not further, and believing that those who are disagreeing with us are therefore morally wrong, as opposed to simply taking the same values that we embody and applying them in a different way, or applying them the same way but coming to a different conclusion. The importance of realizing that just because we have disagreements does not mean that we have to assume that people with whom we're arguing in the Jewish people are chas v'shalom bad people. We're all working with the same basic assumption. We have to work together to get it. And that's a good note to end on this very, very, I guess I'll call it a thoughtful day, a day that is bitter and hopefully will see the return of several hostages, which is sweet as well. Mm-hmm. And God willing, we should only hear good news as we move forward. Dr. Tanya White, I appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is sponsored by the Eden Project by Rotem Shani, located on Hasavyon Street, right across from the Scheinfeld neighborhood, in the heart of my hometown of Beit Shemesh. It's actually just minutes away from where I live. This puts you in a convenient and central location that has easy access to religious ganim, schools, shuls, and shopping, but is also surrounded by trees and parks and overlooks the Elah Valley. The development will include 5 beautifully designed and spacious apartment buildings, but this isn't just a typical complex. This is a community that will be nurtured by a shul with a wonderful rabbi and rebbitzin. I'm pleased to announce that Rabbi and Rebbitzin Benny and Chani Krohn of the Young Israel of Teaneck will be leading the spiritual development of this project as they make Aliyah to Eden with their 4 children and create a kehillah with an unwavering commitment to Torah values, Ahavat Yisrael, and the core principles of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. I was very excited when I heard that Rabbi and Rebbitzin Krohn were going to be part of this project. My family and the Krohns go back decades, and the Krohn family are genuinely among the finest people I've ever met in my life. The fact that Rabbi and Rebbitzin Krohn will be part of the Eden Project ensures that this development will be special indeed. For more information, please contact Rena Weinberg by emailing info@edenbeitshemesh.com. That's info@edenbeitshemesh.com. You can find the link in the description of this podcast. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.